Kristallnacht, The Night of Broken Glass. A chapter from the book. There is no such thing as a typical librarian. By Steven Antonuccio. One of the most powerful and chilling interviews that we ever recorded at our library studios was with Adele Obodov. Adele was a witness to Kristallnacht when she was a 12-year-old Jewish girl living in Cologne, Germany. She was a credible and articulate witness to pure hate that she experienced in her birthplace of Germany. An evening of terror that exploded into a murderous rampage during that horrible night of broken glass. The original interview of Adele was the concept of Paulette Greenberg. Paulette Greenberg and her husband cardiologist Dr. David Greenberg created the Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance in 2003. They initiated a video history project to document the lives of Holocaust survivors and record their personal stories in their own words. The Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance often partnered with the Pikes Peak Library District to sponsor speakers and programs that promoted tolerance and understanding. They occasionally brought in Holocaust survivors as witnesses to some of the most horrific examples of intolerance in our world history. My friend Sharon Marcus, who is editing this book, is currently vice president of the GCLT and the founder of the Paperclip campaign, now an international program to honor Holocaust victims during the annual Days of Remembrance. Paulette enlisted the help of Jane and Bob Neff. Jane and Bob were married video producers and volunteers who utilized our library studio and produced several documentaries which we aired on the Library Channel. They were both school teachers in Colorado Springs, and they worked hand in hand with the Greenberg Center for Learning and Tolerance. Shooting the interview in our studio, the Neffs, through the Greenberg Center History Project, produced Adele Obodov, A Time of Remembrance. It is an extremely important first-hand account of what happened during Kristallnacht. Adele Obodov moved to Colorado Springs in 1952 and was a member of Temple Shalom, the largest synagogue in Colorado Springs. Although I've produced hundreds of documentaries, none was more important than helping Jane and Bob record Adele's memories. When Adele first walked into the studio, I immediately understood that she was a woman of great character and grace. A very intelligent woman, her detailed memory of that horrific time and place was impeccable. As she talked about her experiences, she spoke with fierce sincerity. Born in Cologne, Germany, Adele's father, Walter Brunel, owned a wholesale supply business for barbershops and beauty parlors. They sold wholesale barbershop chairs, wigs, and other beauty products. Like most Jewish businesses at that time in Cologne, the building also housed the family in an upstairs apartment. Around 1934, Hitler started implementing his racist policies in Germany, isolating the Jewish population. Adele's earliest memories of this kind of intolerance was not being able to go to ice rinks she had frequented because she was Jewish. Unfortunately, things just got worse from there for the Jewish population of Cologne. On November 7, 1938, Polish Jew Herschel Grinspan entered the German embassy in Paris and asked to see an embassy official. An embassy staff office clerk, Ernst von Rath, left his desk to meet him, and Grinspan fired 5 bullets into his body and murdered the German clerk. The murder became an international incident and an excuse for the Nazi Party to take revenge on the Jewish population living in Germany. 2 days after the murder, mobs of German citizens, with the blessing and the participation of the Nazi SS, torched thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues. Over 1,000 Jewish synagogues were burnt to the ground, and over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. This violent riot resulted in the murder of 91 Jews. Shortly after Kristallnacht, 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps. This was just the beginning of the Holocaust. Like she did every school day, 12-year-old Adele said goodbye to her mother, Erna Brunel, and walked with her cousin to her classes at the John Jewish School operated by Dr. Eric Klebansky. Adele's school was conveniently adjacent to her synagogue. As they walked through the city, Adele and her cousin noticed that several of the Jewish businesses had shattered windows. When they arrived at the plaza, where their synagogue was located, they saw that there was broken glass everywhere, and several of the religious objects and Torahs had been thrown in the street. They immediately became fearful for their lives and ran home. I hadn't been home for a few minutes when the mob smashed the door of my father's store, and they went into our business and they literally smashed everything in sight. They ripped the shelves from the sides of the building, and the shelves were literally like a V or a tent, tipped in on each other. My mother must have been somewhat naive because she got on the phone to call the local police. And, of course, nothing happened. I don't know if they just hung up on her, but of course, they never came. At the time, I didn't think she was naive, but she must have thought the police were there to protect her because she had lived in Cologne all her life. Pretty soon, these people started coming up the stairs. The entrance to our apartment was frosted glass. It wasn't a solid door, and we could see the mob standing outside and hear them talking. And for whatever reason, and to this day, nobody knows why, they decided not to come into the apartment. They left. And that was Kristallnacht. Adele's chilling words made me aware of how important it was for us to record her testimony. She had been face to face with real evil. Although it was emotionally difficult for her to talk about that time, it was very important to her to share that experience, so hopefully it wouldn't be repeated. History seems to have come to the conclusion that the fact that Kristallnacht was allowed to happen, without any objections in the international world, that it was the start of the Holocaust. It was the start of the tremendous persecution that killed 11 million people in camps and gas chambers, 6 million of whom were Jews. I think it is important to remember Kristallnacht, so that if something else along those lines were to occur somewhere, that people would stop and say that this isn't right, that something ought to be done about it before it mushrooms into such a tremendous tragedy. I just think that it's absolutely important to stand up and say what you think is right, and I have tried to live my life that way. After Kristallnacht, her family's and the Jewish community's problems were just beginning. There were 20,000 people of Jewish faith in Cologne at that time, and only 8,000 were able to leave the country. The rest of the 12,000 Cologne Jewish population died in the Holocaust. Men, women, and children. Even before Kristallnacht, Dr. Erich Klebanski anticipated the horrible fate for the Jews in Germany and his school. Early on in 1936, after making arrangements with the congregation of a synagogue in London, Dr. Klebanski was able to transfer 120 of his students to London, where the children lived with individual families until a hostel could be arranged for them. Adele Obodov was one of those students, and her respect and gratitude for Dr. Klebanski has never diminished. Unfortunately, Dr. Klebanski and his family never joined his students in London. Dr. Klebanski and his family were deported in July 1942. During their transport, they were unloaded from the train, and Dr. Klebanski and his wife and 4 sons were shot and killed in a forest in the region of Minsk. In an attempt to acknowledge and to accept responsibility for the horrors of their Nazi history, in 1990, a plaza in Cologne, Germany, was dedicated to the memory of Dr. Erich Klebanski and his heroic efforts. Adele was now alone in London without her family, and the war broke out with Germany in 1939. The British moved Adele, as well as millions of British children, into the English countryside. When she was 14, her British education ended, and Adele returned to London and to the hostel, along with the other girls who were in the same situation. She then found employment as a sewing machine operator in the war industry for England. Meanwhile, her parents and her older brother Carl, who were still in Germany, were desperate to leave. Her parents acquired a visa for her 17-year-old brother from a relative in America, and he escaped to the United States in August of 1939. This was just a month before England and France declared war on Germany. While in the United States, her brother was drafted in the U.S. Army, and he became a naturalized United States citizen. Once he became an American citizen, he worked desperately to get his parents out of Germany. He secured a visa and passport for his parents in 1942, and they fled Cologne on a train to Lisbon, Portugal. Since it was wartime and most of the trains were used for German troop movement, it took them 72 hours to arrive in Lisbon, and the ship that they had booked passage on had already left the port when they arrived. The American Joint Distribution Committee, which helped thousands of Jews to leave Nazi Germany, secured them a place to live in Barcelona, Spain. They lived in Barcelona for a year before they were able to depart to the United States in 1943. Once they were in the United States, they worked on getting their daughter Adele's transportation to the United States from England. Adele left England on an almost empty troopship returning to Canada in 1944. After a 5-year separation, Adele and her entire immediate family were finally able to reunite in the United States. 2 of Adele's aunts and her uncle and their families were able to immigrate to Argentina and America, but the rest of her extended family in Cologne perished in the Holocaust. Adele's brother Carl became a first lieutenant in Patton's 3rd Army Division as a commander of a tank. In the ultimate in poetic justice, Carl ended up returning to Cologne as a combat soldier fighting Nazi Germany. In 1950, Adele moved to Colorado and met her future husband Maury Obodov, at a Jewish center in Denver. They married in 1952 and moved to Colorado Springs, where she has lived most of her life. Adele and Maury had 3 children, Judith, Joel, and Janet, and all 3 children graduated from Palmer High School. Unfortunately, Judy, died of breast cancer at 38 years old, and she is survived by her 2 children. Janet moved to Seattle, where Adele currently lives in order to be closer to her daughter. Their son Joel moved to Israel and lives there today with his family. Joel is a veteran of the Israel Army and has maintained dual citizenship with the United States. Adele has a total of 7 grandchildren, and 3 of her grandchildren live in Israel. Ironically, after all the anti-Semitism she experienced in Europe, Colorado Springs was a restricted community when Adele moved to the city during the 50s. Both blacks and Jews were not allowed to stay in some of the local hotels, and they could not join certain country clubs or live in restricted neighborhoods. She personally spoke up against these policies. And eventually, Colorado Springs became completely integrated in the 1960s. What Adele experienced and saw with her own eyes during her life is extraordinary. She is a powerful voice for what can happen when intolerance becomes the official policy of a country. Her story is told in the documentary Adele Obodov, A Time to Remember, which can be seen on YouTube.